There's an African proverb that says, if you know someone's story, you cannot harm them. I feel that. In my 3 decades as a filmmaker, a media educator, and a public television producer, director, and executive producer, I've tried to harness the empathy machine that is cinema to center our shared humanity. But in over a century of moving image media, it's done as much damage and destruction as it has good. This can be seen in a range of work, from Hollywood's first feature film, 1915's The Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the Ku Klux Klan, all the way up until now in the often toxic social media streams and content on our phones. Media matters, and it can change perspective, perception, and point of view for better or worse. My first experience with this was as a little kid. My family was gathering around our old black and white TV, with the rabbit ear antennas, some of you feel me, to watch the evening news. So this was a thing back in the day, y'all. 1 in 3 Americans would watch national network news every night in real time. We were watching Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in the history of broadcasting. He was reporting on a story of how US pilots chased away a Russian bomber. Now, these non-shooting aerial duels weren't uncommon during the Cold War. But in this instance, the Americans took photos of the Russian aircrew holding up 2 fingers. And as I remember it, Walter Cronkite described how the Russians were defiantly showing the V for victory sign. Now, I'm a 70s kid. 2 fingers is a peace sign. So maybe the Russians were challenging the Americans with the V for victory sign. It was a thing coming out of World War II. But maybe they were making a grand gesture for peace. Maybe they were trying to end the Cold War with a simple gesture. The point is, Walter Cronkite was imprinting his perspective on the image and trying to inform mine in the process. This was my first eye of the beholder media moment, and it stayed with me ever since. Now, another North Star in my media work is Gordon Parks. Gordon is one of the most important photographers in history. He was the first African-American photographer for a range of national publications, including Vogue and Life magazine, which was like the Instagram of the 20th century. But Gordon got his start in the Twin Cities, where he first experimented with photography. Gordon would go on to literally change the world and change perceptions with his photojournalism. Gordon said he first picked up the camera as his choice of weapons to fight what he hated most in the universe: racism, intolerance, and poverty. Gordon's work was more than just pictures. He created windows and mirrors, allowing us to see each other and ourselves. Now, photography and all lens art can be kind of extractive and exploitive. Think about the phrase, you literally take a picture, take someone's picture. But Gordon's approach was to establish a rapport with his subject, to create understanding, empathy, communicate, and then take the picture. A combination of ethics and authenticity that led to powerful art. Gordon also was a prolific composer. He wrote many books, and he became Hollywood's first black filmmaker. I got to put Gordon in front of the camera for my first documentary. I was so nervous, but I hoped I showed Gordon the same kind of respect and honest listening and empathy that I learned from his work. And I hope it's shown up in my work ever since. I'd like to share a few stories with you about some of my work. Years ago, Twin Cities PBS had an alternative nightly news show. Newsnight Minnesota was meant to be a counter to the mainstream news of the day. It was kind of a new point of view in local TV news. And I was a feature producer creating stories on arts, history, diversity, education. But my favorite story that I produced was on a community garden. This was the 90s. This garden was in the neighborhood I grew up in. And this was a tough time for the neighborhood. Crime, gang violence, drug addiction, human trafficking. There was a lot of difficult things going on. A national reporter had referred to Minneapolis as Murderapolis in this era. But with this community garden, neighbors could come together in the garden, dig in the dirt, get to know each other, and maybe grow community in the process. It was fertile ground for great stories. So I produced a series following the growing season from a chilly April garden cleanup all the way through to the final harvest and the first blankets of snow. One day we were filming a story, and my videographer was getting footage of these two adorable little girls who were like watering a tomato plant. But a little later on, I saw them across the street, and they were watching fearfully as their father was being taken away by the police. So I tapped my videographer on the shoulder and indicated that he should film it. He looked at me with an expression like, that's kind of stereotypical, isn't it? But in my artistic arrogance, I thought juxtaposing that image to the image of the girls in the garden would make for a powerful story. But it was problematic. And I got a call from the garden organizer afterwards who was frustrated with the story. She suggested, like Gordon Parks might have, that I actually get to know the family. So I did. And the girls' parents told me that the girls had been invited into the garden by two women, a couple who lived next door, and they became their garden mentors. So what a great story. And it became one of the stories in my series. Now, over a decade later, I was working on a different project and thought it might be interesting to check in with the gardeners. So I contacted the family and the garden mentors, and we reunited in the garden on the south side. The garden mentors were thrilled to see the family again. And the girl's mother did tell me that at the time we were doing this story, her and her husband were struggling with addiction. And so she was so glad that the girls had the mentors in the garden to get away from some of the stresses at home. The girls, who were now amazing young women, thanked the gardeners. One of them said tearfully that they'd never know how much time in the garden meant to her. Well, I don't think any of the gardeners know how much it meant to me to tell their story and how much I learned in the process, and I think about it even today. One project that I produced is a good example of how sometimes reframing the issue, taking a new angle, can offer a new perspective. I started a project on domestic violence with a group that included Ellen Pence. And Ellen was a real pioneer in domestic violence interventions. But she was here in Minnesota. Her work was really regarded across the nation and utilized across the nation. And I remember as we were starting the film project, talking with Ellen about what kind of women survivor stories we might include and how we might film women survivors to make them comfortable. And she stopped me and said, "We're not including women survivor stories in this film." I was confused. We're doing a documentary on domestic violence, shouldn't we? And she said, survivor stories are important. And the good news is there's a lot of content out there that holds space for survivor stories. But she said, domestic violence isn't just their issue, and it's definitely not women's fault. It's yours. It's men. So our film is going to focus on how boys and men grow up in America's stew of toxic masculinity. A new perspective was needed on an issue that was already something we knew about and were working on. Ellen had been sick throughout the production. She had been struggling with cancer for years. And unfortunately, she died shortly after we finished the film and released it. But Ellen was right. And our documentary, With Impunity, Men and Gender Violence, is a powerful entry into the domestic violence intervention tool resource field and is still being used in teaching today. So a lot of my work, like With Impunity, deals with history. History helps us understand headlines. Think about an issue today, maybe the cost of college, the unhoused, or a constitutional crisis. Looking at the origin and arc of a story gives us better perspective. So I've explored stories of people, place, and the past in a lot of my work. One story about local history that I was assigned was to explore some of Minnesota's LGBTQ+ history. Now, not being a part of the community, a phrase came to mind: it can't be about us without us. So I was supported by scholars, advisors, and elders from the LGBTQ+ community, and we created Out North, MN LGBTQ History, an amazing feature film that shines a light on pioneering individuals, organizations, lifts up Indigenous Two-Spirit identity, offers a tour of historic gay bars, reminds us that in the 80s, an AIDS HIV diagnosis was a death sentence. And it also celebrates the singular power of love with the story of Michael and Jack, the first same-sex couple to be legally married in America, who were here in Minnesota and were married in the early 70s. Now, OGs and elders like Michael and Jack are often frustrated that the story is always about San Francisco or New York. Well, last year, I got a call from the Stonewall National Monument in New York. They asked if they could show clips from out north in their visitor center, adding the Minnesota perspective to the national narrative. Now, my most important and impactful film helps us answer the question, why does Minnesota have some of the worst racial disparities in the nation? Jim Crow of the North offers, again, historic perspective, and it's changed a lot of people's perceptions about opportunity and equity in America. So we're all familiar with Jim Crow segregation in the South, but a little over a century ago in the North, real estate developers started adding clauses deep into the deeds of housing developments. These clauses or covenants prohibited people of color, and specifically and always people of African descent, from ever buying, owning, or even occupying these homes forever. And there are tens of thousands of them in Minnesota alone. These racist covenants and then the red lines, the maps that followed them, created a hard-to-see but solid system of segregation in the North. And the system wasn't really ended until the late 60s in the Fair Housing Act. And by then, the damage was done. As we know in America, wealth is developed generally through home ownership, and this system prevented that for many. Now, a few years ago, a group called Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota started researching, documenting, and mapping these restrictive covenants. So my documentary, Jim Crow of the North, followed their work and also explored this hidden history of how racist covenants reshaped the landscape of the Twin Cities. So Jim Crow of the North and Mapping Prejudice inspired a movement, and both are a part of a collective of organizations and advocates who are working on housing equity, racial justice, making real policy change, and making real perception change too, even helping to create bipartisan legislation that allows Minnesotans to discharge or renounce the racist covenant in their home's deed. Jim Crow of the North, in its 5 years out in the world, has been seen by millions of people. It's been used in countless classrooms, in college campuses, and community convenings. Its YouTube page has over 11,000 comments, many of which speak to the power of narrative change. One comment says, "Every American should watch this," so watch it. Another says, "This changes my perspective on how racism affects my neighborhood, even when I can't see it." And one comment says, from a white person, ostensibly to the black community, "My heart aches at your journey. My heart sings that you are here." Remember, it's harder to hurt someone when you know their story. Thank you.